All right, how you guys doing today? Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Again, Tier Talk, the only show that's dedicated to corrections. And today I have two guests, but today I'm actually going to kind of give you the reins here, Bob. Now, we've had Bob on my show before. He's the president, Bob Ricardella, he's the president of the ACA, the New Jersey chapter. And we want to talk about criminal justice reform. So he was able to get us an excellent guest all the way from Montana. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to forward the show to Bob, and I'm going to kind of have him take the reins and lead the show. But I do want to thank you. I know you're extremely busy. So thank you for not only coming on the show, but bringing me such a wonderful guest and also bringing this out there because the public doesn't know what you're about ready to say.
Nope, and thank you, Anthony, for having us. You're a board member of ACA, one of our more energetic board members. I love your enthusiasm. I love what you do for the cause. But today is actually a very special day because we have Todd Clear, who is a professor at Rutgers University, the School of Criminal Justice. Todd is an expert in the field of criminal justice in New Jersey. You are currently on sabbatical in Montana, working on a new book. His most recent book is the Punishment Imperative, and that is by NYU Press. But Todd has written 13 books and over 100 articles for various magazines and publications. So it is really special to have Todd on today. And what we wanted to speak about was basically the New Jersey's criminal justice system, where we were, where we are, and where we think we're going with criminal justice reform in the state of New Jersey. So Todd, if you could just give us an overview, where were we 20, 30 years ago in criminal justice in New Jersey? Because I know that you have done a lot of articles and books on mass incarceration. So if you can give us an overview of where you think we were.
Well, so 20 years ago, we were roughly about halfway through a long period of prison expansion in the United States. In the last year that the prison population in the United States dropped was 1971. Between that and 2010, so about 20 years ago, we were halfway through that period. That's the longest era of prison population expansion in the history of the United States, probably in the history of the world. And no one thought it was going to run another 20 years or so, and people thought that this was a characteristic of American criminal justice that set us apart. We didn't know how much it set us apart from the rest of the world until around 5 or 6 years ago, when much more conversation about the size of the prison population in the U.S. started happening around the country. But and New Jersey was like the rest of the country. We had a growing prison population. Sometimes we were growing 3% a year, sometimes 5 or 8% a year, but always growing. And in those days, states that were growing slowly might have been growing 1 or 2% a year during a period of time, but every state changed, grew rapidly for some period, and then less rapidly other period. But it was always every state had the same story.
It was a steady upward march as far as incarceration.
Right. Mm-hmm. And New Jersey was like the rest of them, and there was regularly legislation proposed in the state legislature to generate new laws that would have the effect of increasing the number of people in prison.
Like truth in sentencing laws and stuff like that. Let's throw the bastards in jail forever laws and things like that.
We're talking, if I may, we're talking about the NERA laws, the mandatory minimums, right? I mean, we're actually talking about 85%.
Not even the NERAs, but in some states, and I don't know if New Jersey was ever one of them. They had what they called truth in sentencing laws, which were really just very harsh laws that appeared tough and were tough, but really weren't accomplishing anything as far as making the streets safer or hopefully lowering our population and doing it safely.
Yeah, so eventually part of the progress here was to not just look inward, but to look outwards. We're sending people out. They're not just going to be here. We have to do something and prep them. Correct? That's where we grew?
Well, no, it's in 1996, President Clinton took the the politics of criminal justice in the 80s and 90s had been this get tough movement, and Democrats in general were seen as being defensive. Well, Bill Clinton took this problem on. When he became president, he became associated with tough legislation on crime, and the '96 Criminal Justice Reform Acts that he passed, that he proposed and then signed into law, established a federal incentive for states to engage in what they called truth in sentencing, which meant that whatever the sentence was, a person convicted of a violent crime would serve 85% of that sentence. It didn't change any of the sentences, but it changed the time served on a sentence.
And it also sort of, made it much tougher on crack cocaine versus powder cocaine at that time, where we were treating like two different drugs when they were actually the same drug.
So the federal legislation, the federal justice system was the one that did this in the most extreme way. The penalties for heroin were 100 times more significant than the penalties for powder cocaine. The penalties for crack cocaine were 100 times more significant than for powder cocaine. Those laws started happening in the late '80s and early '90s, and New Jersey passed a number of mandatory sentences and expanded sentences for people convicted of drug crimes. Some of our legislation was not as extreme as what happened in the federal jurisdiction or in other states, but certainly for New Jersey's history, we went from about 10% of the people entering prison system coming in for drug crimes every year to about half.
And in 1999, I believe, is when we peaked out in our prison population. We were roughly about 32,000 people incarcerated at that time, and now we've had a steady decline. As for 20 years, we had a steady march up in prison in the population. For the last 18 years, we've had a steady march down. Is that accurate?
That's correct, and we have the longest consistent drop in prison numbers in the nation. About a third of from our peak year, we're down by about a third. That's larger than any other state, including California and New York, which are the ones everybody talks about. But New York, actually, its peak is a little later than ours, and its drop is about 25%. California's peak is significantly later than ours, and its drop is about 30%. But we are larger than either of those two states.
And the last study I looked at, I think it might have been the Brennan Center for Justice. Over half of the states in the country are still going up.
So, each year the reports have a different number of states. So almost every state, 17 states have not yet peaked. But of the states, more than 30 are lower than their peak year. So there's a national trend. But last year, about half of the states had an increase, including some that had decreases before. And that's been true. That pattern has been true now since about 2010.
And what is the reason why would states that were starting to decrease, why have they gone back up again?
So to talk about prison populations, it's important to begin with what Jim Austin and I called in an article a few years ago the iron law of prison populations, and that is the number of people in prison is entirely produced by two rates: the rate that people go in and the rate of time and the length of time they stay. And so in states that have had growth, most of those states have had changes in the number of people going in that year, and that's mostly produced either by revocation of parole and probation or by increases in prison sentences for people convicted of nonviolent crimes.
Because a large amount of the people who are going back in are on parole violations, so they're being reincarcerated, and that makes that number rise. As we're in New Jersey, because of graduated sanctions and some other things we're doing, we've actually stopped that in its tracks.
Part of New Jersey's success story is the way that it has reduced the rate at which people go back into prison when they're on probation or parole, particularly parole, and that is around sanctions. The other portion is the drug courts. Now, there's not, I don't specific yet definitive information about the impact of the drug courts, but everything I've seen indicates that a fairly substantial percentage of the people going into the drug courts would have gone to prison if they had not had the drug court option, and the rate of success of drug courts is pretty high. So those two changes, the changes in the rate of number of people going in on the front end from directly sentenced for drug-related crimes, and then people going in again on the back end, revoked from probation or parole, those two numbers have had significant impact on the prison population in New Jersey. The other big thing that happened in New Jersey is that we didn't change anything. We didn't lengthen sentences. We didn't pass a bunch
We didn't make
statutes.
it worse.
Right. Most states have passed recidivism statutes that increase length of stay for people convicted of second and third felonies, and those the effects of those laws are not felt for a while, but then they're really long term. The effect is long term once they are felt. So, for example, if the average, this was true in New Jersey, if the average person convicted of a second violent felony was going to get a 10-year sentence and serve 7 of those years, and you have a new law that says they'll get a 25-year sentence and serve 20 of those years, it doesn't change anything for 7 years. Mm-hmm. Right? They would have been in anyway. So you don't even feel it for 7 years. But then 7 years out, you're going to feel it for 13 years.
Okay. All right. So that going back to parole and probation, the fact that there's been this paradigm shift, that we have broken the paradigm of one misstep and you're back in, has not only contributed to lowering our population, but we seem to be having better outcomes with both parole and probation, where people are more successful, and we seem to have found ways to change them. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, and most of the time, this kind of thing has to be seen as working at the margins. So the effects don't have to be big on the averages if the numbers are big that are going in. So, for example, if you ordinarily would have had 3,000 people going in as parole revocations, and you change that number to 1,000, that has that will have a big effect on prison populations. Even if the rate of that 1,000, they fail, the 2,000 who didn't go in, many of them fail again, right? So you're working both at the rate of failure, but by giving a person another chance to try to, through a treatment program or some other kind of intervention, not go to prison. But then you're also, because on the average you do that, but then you're also just simply cutting that number that go in the first time significantly. Over time, that is the New Jersey story. It has big. The fact that we've reduced our prison population by 1/3 is like a national headline.
Yeah, and I think it's even better than that now, because I think we were at almost 32, and this year I think we're at 19.6 or something like that. And last time I did the math, it was close to 40%. It was 38, 39% really, which I thought was incredible.
Right, our numbers continue to decline, mm-hmm. And this will be true if we don't. So this is an interesting challenge too. But if we don't pass legislation increasing length of stay for large categories of people, and we continue to be very conservative about the use of revocation, our numbers will decline. Mm-hmm. But what that means is the concentration of people incarcerated becomes much more heavily slanted toward people convicted of violent crimes, and it really raises what is the much more interesting to me, but also challenging proposition: what do you do about people who are convicted of violent crimes?
And that's one of the things we wanted to speak about.
I think New Jersey, that's the conversation in New Jersey now that we need to start having.
But before I ask you that question, when we speak about the drop in the population, I think the really incredible part of this whole story is that there's been a drop in the real crime rate and a drop in the recidivism rate. How do you tie those three together? Because I think that's really the key to the whole success, that there are less people in prison and things are safer, and we appear to be changing people's lives where they're not back on that merry-go-round of crime and going back into prison.
Well, so the first one I think is pretty straightforward. As crime rates drop, the number of people being arrested for crimes also drops, and therefore the number of people going into prison for those crimes will also drop. So if you don't change anything, as crime rates go down, you would expect prison populations to decline. It didn't happen nationally, but it certainly happens in New Jersey. But the other thing is that, and I think that reflects the fact that going to prison doesn't change much about a person, except makes it harder for them to succeed once they're released from prison. So not very many good lessons are learned during a stay in prison, sort of life-changing, life-improving lessons that are learned during a stay in prison. What changes people's likelihood of getting involved in criminal justice problems again is what happens to them on the outside. And it is there where making sure people have housing, trying to provide jobs, but in particular being very careful to react quickly when a person gets back involved in drug or alcohol use, so that you can stop that before problems come, before crime-related problems come.
And that's why the graduated sanctions and on probation, that we're not just putting you back in for one dirty urine or one lapse with alcohol. We're going to put you in a STEPS program and try to get you help before we have to put you back behind the wall, which helps nothing.
And if I may, you brought up a very good point, because a lot of people, and this is good that we had this discussion, always seem to blame the system when a person comes out and then goes back in. They blame the system as a failure to do what they can behind the wall to properly maybe program or whatever it is to make sure this person's available, or make sure this person's able to make better choices. But you just actually hit something right on the head. I think society also has to pick up on the work that we're doing and continue on that work. So if we do all we can behind the wall, there has to be some place for that individual to go to so they can make the better choices. We could teach them how to make the better choices, but they have to be given the opportunity to make those better choices, correct?
That's correct. And in New Jersey, the largest proportion of people returning to their communities from prison return to a handful of communities. Trenton, Newark, Patterson, Camden. You can name them. So if we can be laser focused on what happens to those people in those places, the difference that we can make is pretty substantial. And I think different cities are approaching that concentration of people in reentry differently. There obviously, on the average, there's a success story there.
And there are some programs now, and the funding and development of programs like I know Volunteers of America and Opportunities for All, the Trenton, I can't think of the but one of the programs in Trenton are doing a great job with people with mental illness, where they connect them with services like housing, Social Security disability, Medicaid, so that they can get their medication regimen, so that we find them a safe place to live, we can get them food, we can get them medication, and we have much better outcomes as opposed to people with mental illness living out on the streets and then resorting to crime, which is only a matter of time before that happens.
And often a person who's living on the streets and getting involved in criminal activity, it's not, it can be relatively petty kinds of crime, generating lots of trouble, but getting them right back in the justice system.
Nuisance crimes.
Says, hey,
yeah.
Look, we've seen you before. What are we going to do now? And so, if you can stop that cycle, the payoff is enormous.
Mm-hmm. May I?
Yep.
It's okay if we have to do a second part of the episode. That's fine. I could always close off one and move on to a second one, because we still have to touch on violent offenders. So we may have to close off one and move on to the second. But I wanted to ask them, just because we're talking about the drop in crime, have you seen that also with juveniles and with females?
So nationally, the story on juveniles and females is different. So nationally, the story about juveniles matches what's happening in New Jersey, which is an enormous reduction in the number of young people who are incarcerated, and a very marked reduction in arrest rates for people under the age of 17, a very significant reduction in arrest rates of people for violent crime under the age of 17. So there's the youth crime problem as a proportion of all the crime problem has been dropping for about 30 years, and is now a fraction of what it was at its peak 40 years ago.
And why is that?
For women, the issue is different. Arrest rates for women have not dropped in the same way that they have for men. They've dropped, but not at the same rate as men. And as a matter of fact, the proportion of people in prison who are women has been growing nationally, because their rate of going in has not been dropping as rapidly as that for men, and they are beginning to, and they return roughly at the same rate as men. So it used to be 25 years ago, you said 92% of the prison population was male. It's now 90. Now that's not a big, again, women are not a big portion of all people in prison, but the story about women is different than the story about men, and it's different than the story about youth.
Okay. As far as getting back to the youth, so youth crime is dropping, although we see in certain areas, we see pockets, like Chicago, where the gangs seem to be, the ones really heavily involved in crime and violence and almost hand-to-hand combat.
So that's interesting about gangs, because while we think of gangs as being youth, in fact, most of the active gang
members,
people who are active in gang activity are in their 20s, and they're outside the youth, what we can think of as the youthful offender range, and they're in young adulthood, and many people who are gang involved who get arrested for violence are in their mid-20s or second half of their 20s. So again, there are criminologists who theorize that the growth of the prison population in the 1980s and 1990s produced a generation of people who are deeply embedded in the criminal justice system, and they're in and out of prisons. Now, I've seen some evidence to support that. I don't think it's the biggest part of the story, but it's an interesting, when you think of gangs, for example, in Newark, when a person is arrested who has a gang affiliation, they're often in their late 20s or early 30s.
Mm-hmm. All right, so it's a misconception that the teenagers are the most violent aspect of the gangs.
There's mixed evidence on that. There was a time period when so much of the gang violence was being driven by drug trade that young people who had not been involved in the criminal justice system that much, and their kids in their 15, 16, 17-year-olds were carrying guns and doing enforcing. That appears to have stopped. Not stopped in the sense of going down to zero, but that pattern has abated tremendously.
Okay.
And it's also the case that while we think of drug-related violence in the cities as being around the drug market, there is some of that, but really, in Newark, for example, almost 2/3 of the shootings have something to do with personal conflicts, rather than you took my drugs or you took my.
They're gang related, but not drug related. They're more,
right. It can be about a girlfriend or about
somebody disrespected
or
me.
Something you did to my brother. So while I think drugs are at the center of a lot of this, the problem is not drugs. The problem with violence is violence, not drugs.
Mm-hmm. So then, moving along to the big picture, when we look at the numbers, 61% of all the inmates in New Jersey prisons right now are in for violent crimes, including homicide, sexual assault, aggravated and simple assault, robbery, kidnapping, and some other violent offenses. And then there's a number of people who are in on just straight drug dealing offenses because their addiction is to the fast life and not necessarily to narcotics. What do we do with the violent people now? How do we change them and get them to stop?
Well, before you answer that, if I may, Todd, we're gonna have to bring this one episode to the close, and then we're gonna go ahead and continue onto another episode. Mm-hmm. So basically, so we might as well. I have to keep them within 28 minutes. So real quick, just as a wrap up for the first episode, basically we talked about the reduction in recidivism rate, right? We talked about the reduction in recidivism, and we also tried to hit on why those trends have happened. Correct? Would you agree with that?
Yep.
Now, what would we like to plan for the next episode?
Well, the next episode we'll talk about violent crime, because I think we've had a great discussion about where we were, where we are now, what the playing field looks like. But I mean, the $90,000 question is what do we do with the violent offenders and how do we change them?
Okay, so Todd, if I may, don't go nowhere. But Todd Clear, he's a criminal justice professor for Rutgers, also the author of The Punishment Imperative, and obviously Bob Ricardella, the president of the ACA, New Jersey chapter. We thank you for watching, and we are going to come right back Well, for us, it's going to be right back. For you guys, it's going to be next week with the next topic, which is what Bob just discussed. So see you guys next